Most people believe that the apartheid began in South Africa in 1948. And yes, on paper, that's true. That's the year the apartheid laws were officially introduced. The signs, the passbooks, the forced segregation, the whites-only system. But here's the thing. By 1948, apartheid was not being created from scratch. It was being organized, because the foundations of that system had already been built nearly 300 years earlier, by the Dutch settlers at the southern tip of Africa. And to understand how apartheid really began, you have to go back to 1652, back to ships, colonies, farmers, land seizures, and a growing belief that one group of people had the right to control another. It was the year 1652, and a man called Jan van Riebeeck was sent to the Cape of Good Hope by the Dutch East India Company in hopes of finding a refreshment station for ships traveling between Europe and Asia, along with fresh food, water, and a place to rest. At first, they weren't trying to build a massive country, but colonies have a way of growing, and slowly, Dutch settlers began staying permanently at the Cape. These settlers would later become known as the Boers, and eventually the Afrikaners. South Africa was actually not an empty land when the Dutch first arrived. The region was already home to indigenous communities like the Khoi and the San people. People had lived there for generations. But the Dutch settlers saw the land very differently from the people already living on it. For many African communities, land was something shared by the community. It wasn't divided by fences or owned by one individual. It was where people lived together, survived together, and stayed connected to their ancestors and traditions. The Dutch, however, believed land could be claimed, owned, fenced off, and controlled. And that difference in how each side understood land would slowly become the beginning of centuries of conflict and dispossession in South Africa. As Dutch settlers expanded further inland, they began taking more grazing land, sometimes through treaties, sometimes through force, sometimes simply by declaring land unused, because it wasn't farmed in a European way. This became one of colonialism's most powerful ideas. If indigenous people weren't using land the European way, then Europeans believed they had the right to take it. And over time, white settlers controlled larger and larger areas of land, while indigenous communities were pushed away from fertile regions and water sources. Land ownership became racialized. White settlers owned. Black Africans were displaced. And that pattern would continue for centuries. Even during apartheid, decades later, land would remain one of the biggest sources of inequality in South Africa, because apartheid was never just about racism. It was also about land, who controlled it, who worked on it, and who benefited from it. And this wasn't just happening quietly in the background. You could actually see the colony becoming more violent, unequal, and divided year by year. One of the clearest examples was the conflict between the Dutch settlers and the Khoi people in the 1600s. In the beginning, the relationship wasn't entirely hostile. The Khoi traded cattle with the Dutch ships arriving at the Cape. There was cooperation, conversation, and exchange. But that slowly started to disappear. As more settlers arrived, they didn't just want to trade anymore. They wanted land, permanent land, land where the Khoi had lived, traveled, and grazed cattle for generations. Farms began spreading further and further outward, and for the Khoi, it started to feel like the ground beneath them was being taken away piece by piece. Eventually, the tension exploded. In 1659, the First Khoi-Dutch War broke out. One of the most important figures in this conflict was a Khoi leader named Doman. What makes his story especially tragic is that he had actually worked closely with the Dutch before the war. He understood their language. He understood how they thought. For a time, he even believed cooperation might be possible. But the more he watched settlers occupy land permanently, the more he realized this wasn't just trade anymore. His people were slowly losing control of their own home. So Doman began organizing resistance against the settlers. Not because he hated Europeans, but because he could already see where the future was heading if nobody fought back. And during the fighting, Dutch settlers began building barriers and defensive lines around their farms near Cape Town. That detail matters more than it might seem, Because even that early, you can already see the foundations of something much bigger beginning to form. The idea that different groups of people should live separately, behind borders, with one side protected by force from the other. The settlers had firearms, cannons, fortified settlements. The Khoikhoi, despite resisting fiercely, were eventually pushed back. But the violence on the frontier didn't end there. In many ways, it only became harsher in the 1700s. As Dutch settlers moved deeper inland, a system known as the commando system started to develop. These were armed settler militias, groups of colonists who could quickly organize into mounted raids whenever conflict broke out on the frontier. Officially, these raids were often described as responses to cattle theft or attacks. But in reality, the violence frequently went far beyond that. One of the communities that suffered the most were the San people. Some settler commandos tracked San groups across vast frontier regions, attacking camps and hunting down entire communities. And this is where the story becomes especially disturbing. In some areas, settlers were reportedly rewarded for killing San people. Not arrested, not punished, rewarded. Imagine what that means for a society. At that point, violence against indigenous Africans was no longer just random frontier brutality. It was slowly becoming accepted, organized, institutionalized. And over generations, that changes people. Children grow up seeing certain lives treated as less valuable. Settlers begin viewing domination as normal. Laws and systems start adapting around that mindset. Long before apartheid officially existed, the foundations of racial separation and racial violence were already being built into everyday life at the Cape. As Dutch farmers moved further inland, many became known as trekboers. These were semi-nomadic frontier farmers living far away from colonial cities. Life on the frontier was violent and unstable. Then came another major turning point. The British took control of the Cape. And interestingly, this changed South Africa dramatically. The British abolished slavery in the 1830s. Many Boer settlers were furious, not only because they lost labor, but because they saw British rule as interference in their way of life. Thousands of Boers left the Cape and moved inland in what became known as the Great Trek. There, they established their own republics. And as they moved deeper into southern Africa, racial segregation continued growing. So even though the British criticized some Boer practices, South Africa still remained deeply unequal. In fact, segregation intensified under both British and Boer systems, because economically, racial inequality benefited white elites across the board. Then everything exploded with the discovery of diamonds and gold in the late 1800s. Suddenly, South Africa became enormously important. Mines needed huge amounts of labor. And once again, authorities turned to systems of control. Black workers were separated into compounds, paid far less, restricted in movement, and monitored constantly. Past laws expanded further. Cheap black labor became essential to the economy. This is something many people miss about apartheid. It was never only about hatred. It was also about economics. South Africa's economy depended on keeping a massive labor force cheap, controlled, and politically powerless. And segregation helped maintain that system. Finally, in 1948, the National Party came to power. This is the moment most people identify as the beginning of apartheid. But by then, the structure already existed. The government simply formalized and expanded older systems. Land dispossession, passed laws, segregated housing, racial labor systems, political exclusion. Apartheid took centuries of colonial practices and turned them into one of the most organized racial systems in modern history. Every person was classified by race. Where you could live was decided by race. Who you could marry, where you could work, even where you could walk. It became segregation engineered at a national scale. But the roots stretched all the way back to the Dutch colony at the Cape. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of this story. Apartheid wasn't created overnight by a few politicians. It evolved slowly, piece by piece, law by law, generation by generation. The apartheid government may have officially begun in 1948, but the road to apartheid started long before that, back when Dutch ships first arrived at the Cape.